now. So this will be about half an hour, 45 minutes maximum, and then time for Q&A. So don't worry, you don't have to sit online for 2 hours as scheduled, because that is a very long time. I've got the PowerPoint screen in front of me, so if you can't hear or if there's a problem, just use the chat function and maybe it'll pop up on my screen. But at the moment, all I can see is the PowerPoint slide. So I'm going to assume that this is working. So regenerative agriculture, what is it and how is it being implemented? Well, this is an area that we have focused on at Innovation Forum for a number of years now. We're a company in London that's been going for about 8 or 9 years. Prior to that, myself and colleagues worked in this area of sustainability, particularly agriculture, for a lot longer. So this information is really based on the last couple of years of conversations and research that we've been doing with large companies, social enterprises, farmers, governments, and so on around the world. And the idea really is to start a process of transforming supply chains to make them more sustainable, not just from an environmental point of view, but also from a social and economic point of view. As many of you may be aware, farming and food production is pretty low margin, and lots of farmers really struggle to survive economically and to look after the land. So regenerative agriculture is supposed to try and solve that problem. So let's talk about what it is and how it's being implemented. Trying to move to the next slide. There we go. So here's one definition of it. You may have seen the documentary on Netflix called Kiss the Ground. If you look in the bottom right hand corner of this slide, you see the reference to that. That's with Woody Harrelson and other folk talking about what regenerative agriculture is doing, particularly in the US, and why it's needed. Effectively, it's about farming and grazing practices that reverse climate change by rebuilding soil organic matter, restoring soil biodiversity. And the idea is you store carbon in the soil, you improve the water cycle, which means you improve water retention and use in soil. And in this definition, they call it a holistic land management practice. But there are different definitions of what regenerative means. This is quite a narrow definition, and there are others. For example, the world's largest retailer, Walmart, is now calling itself a regenerative company, or a company that's aiming to be regenerative, I should say more accurately. That's a very different proposition with a much broader definition. And I don't think it's been particularly well defined or thought through yet. So that you've got two approaches to being regenerative. One is to be a regenerative organization, which covers all sorts of things like diversity in recruitment and management practices across the business. And then you have regenerative in agriculture, which is much more about how you use land, help farmers restore ecosystems, etc. For the purposes of this discussion, we're going to focus on agriculture and land use, not on the broader paradigm of being a regenerative company, because that's just too complicated and not enough is known about what it means yet. This is the classic thing you see when you go onto Google Images and put in regenerative agriculture, as I did. Quite a lot of the originators of this concept, or those that see themselves as the originators in a modern sense, focus on regenerative organic agriculture. Now, organic, as you probably know, means not using chemical inputs. Traditionally, organic is about things that you don't do rather than things that you do, by which I mean organic means taking out artificial inputs such as fertilizer, pesticides, fungicides, and that kind of thing that are made of synthetic materials, i.e. fossil fuels. So the regenerative organic movement is one of the groups that's sort of claiming to own this space, but there are many other perspectives as well. We're going to talk about some of the ways large food companies are approaching regenerative, which is quite different. You'll note here the key use of the word organic and the approach that they use. You'll see in other slides. So having cover crops, composting, crop rotation, but then they also talk about tillage Now, tillage is a huge issue in agriculture. You've all probably seen farmers ploughing fields. Now, the reason you plough a field is to plant new seeds and to take out weeds. But tillage or ploughing causes huge problems because you're basically ripping up the landscape and allowing soil to oxidize, which releases greenhouse gas emissions, and it can cause erosion. It can cause all sorts of problems. And traditionally, organic farming has actually done quite a lot of tillage. The reason they've done it is because they don't like using pesticides and herbicides in particular. And of course, if you don't use herbicides, you get weeds. How do you pull up weeds? Well, you run a plough over the field. So regenerative organic agriculture is trying to move that on to say, actually, don't till the soil with a plough. And I've met a number of organic farmers who still think ploughing the soil is fine because it's what they've always done. But actually, as we can see from the middle right-hand side part of this slide, if you can read that bit about tillage, it can cause all sorts of problems. However, in this paradigm of regenerative organic agriculture, they discourage tilling and focus on soil health and reversing climate change, as you can see here. This is the Regenerative Organic Certified organization, which is based in the US. These tend to be kind of smaller, very progressively minded, ethical, sustainable small companies who sign up for this. There are some vineyards that have signed up for it. Patagonia, the clothing company, which also has a food business, is also signed up for this. And you might call this kind of the hardcore approach, because you'll see the word organic is still in there, and it's a certification system in the sense that it offers some kind of audit and assurance. In other cases, regenerative is seen much more as what we would call a paradigm. A simple definition of a paradigm is a way of looking at the world. So in other examples we'll see later, regenerative isn't up for certification. It's an approach that you take, a philosophy that you take towards the land, if you like, rather than a certification system. But for some actors in this space, such as Regenerative Organic Certified, ROC, they want to have a certification model because their standard is pretty rigorous and they want to put labels on products and show people how sustainable they are. You'll see similar descriptions of regenerative approaches throughout this presentation. Here's another one of them: soil health, animal welfare, and social fairness. And so that brings in the broader paradigm or the broader approach of regenerative being a social issue as much as an environmental one. And you can see there that under social fairness, they include no forced labour, living wages, good working conditions, fair payments for farmers, and democratic organisations. So quite ambitious compared to some of the other approaches that we will see. And this is how they suggest organisations go on the road to becoming regenerative organic certified. You can see there year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4 and above. And they're building in use of all the other certifications you see in sustainable agriculture. Fair trade is there with the food justice certification, animal welfare approved, global animal partnerships, responsibly grown, farm worker assured, lots of different existing certifications brought together under one approach to regenerative organic. And this is really being done by the kind of small, sustainable minded businesses that really focus on promoting themselves as sustainable and organic alternatives to mainstream commercial products. Change of pace here from the smaller brands over to Nestle. Nestle, as you may know, is the world's largest food company. We at Innovation Forum do a lot of work with Nestle, helping them engage with the world, by which I mean we help them talk to stakeholders and critical voices and benchmark their approach. They are an enormous company and they have a huge impact, and they have some direct relationships with farmers which they're trying to improve. Now, critics of Nestle will point out that a lot of their product portfolio is still pretty unhealthy, and they are aware of that and they're trying to change it. They have, for example, sold off some brands which really were pretty unsustainable in terms of the fat, sugar content or design of them. And they're attempting to launch more sustainable products. We worked with them on the launch of their Wunder product, which is a pea product. It's pea milk, which doesn't sound very nice, but it is actually. Effectively, it's a dairy alternative that's made out of peas because they're high in protein, and you can get it in most supermarkets now next to your Oatly or your soy milk. And of course, soy milk is now under fire because it has quite a big environmental impact if not farmed correctly, i.e. a lot of soy will come from Brazil or Argentina, whether it's either genetically modified, which for some people is unacceptable, or it can be grown in areas which are accused of causing enormous biodiversity impact, like the Cerrado, for example, where deforestation accusations are being levelled at the soy industry every day by NGOs and governments in the West or in Northern Europe particularly. So Nestle has this product called Wunder, which is from peas, and the peas are grown in Europe and they can be grown as a cover crop, and they're called nitrogen fixers, which means if you plant peas in between rows of other crops, they help fix nitrogen into the ground, and they help your soil stay healthy. So the idea for Nestle was to make a product which is pretty high margin if you look at the price of it compared to cow's milk, provide a dairy alternative in the marketplace, and also contribute to regenerative agriculture. And as you can see, they are investing quite a lot of money. Now, a critic might argue, 1.2 billion Swiss francs by 2025. Well, what's that compared to Nestle's turnover? But you have to start somewhere as a company. And what they're trying to do is to take a careful approach to regenerative agriculture that can scale across many farmers. Because for an ethical brand that has a very small production and a small distribution, it's much easier to manage that supply chain, particularly if you're charging premiums for your product like a Patagonia will. But for Nestle, they have to compete with other supermarket products. So they have to take an approach which they hope can be scalable, and that's what they're trying to do. They have worked with farmers for many years to try and improve inputs and to try and improve outputs, and regenerative agriculture is a way that they are getting very excited in terms of reframing their approach to working with farmers. It's early days yet. We helped them launch their strategy a few months ago, and they have some 30 pilot farms around the world where they are trying to understand how regenerative agriculture will work in practice, and critically how it can be scaled to other farms. So I could understand any of you that wish to be critical of a large company engaging in this space. Does it sound like greenwashing? Well, yes, it can. The devil is always in the detail. How much are they spending? In this case, 1.2 billion Swiss francs is quite a lot of money in agriculture. And secondly, it'll all be about the results that they have in a few years' time. So I would suggest to critics that they wait to see what comes out of this before deciding whether or not they think it's greenwash. And this is the Nestle kind of approach to it. You've seen this before in earlier slides. An approach on living soils for healthy food, restoring farmland, ecosystems, agroforestry, cover cropping. Agroforestry is when you have trees in and around fields, which is very good for soil health, very good for rain, very good for water retention. You've all driven through modern agricultural landscapes where it's just one crop for kilometre after kilometre and nothing else. Well, that isn't good for the land. So the idea is that we draw down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by having more trees, more cover crops, healthier soil, etc. Again, you've seen some of this before in earlier slides. In some ways, the Nestle approach isn't that different from what I mentioned earlier under the Regenerative Organic Certification program. A focus on biodiversity, focus on reducing chemical farm inputs, improving soil health, and having optimized grazing in farming systems where feasible. So you'll note the Nestle language is different. You don't see a claim that the whole thing's organic, because from their point of view, their farmers going organic, unless they're selling their product for a significant premium, they're not going to be able to afford it. And it doesn't necessarily mean that organic means lower yields, but it often does. Not in every case, but there's often what you call a yield lag. When you switch to organic, the first few years you can suffer from a lower yield, which means lower financial considerations for the farmer, but that can over time even out, either through premiums paid on the products or through more resilient landscapes, and actually in some cases improving yield over time. So it's a bit like anything. When you want to change a system, you've got to invest in it, and you have to put some resources into that, and over time you make your money back, but you don't get an immediate result in every case. And you can see the priority actions here at the bottom of the slide. Organic fertilizers are something that Nestle and everybody else wants farmers to use. That's because they want to reduce their fossil fuel footprint. That fossil fuel footprint, in their case, is the use of inorganic fertilizers, i.e. fertilizers made of petrochemicals. As you may be aware, most fertilizers are made from nitrogen, and they're made often from petrochemicals, and they end up on the fields, and of course that then ends up in the atmosphere. So the idea is to use organic fertilizers which don't come from fossil fuels, and that will help Nestle and farmers reduce their greenhouse gas emissions footprint. And in many cases, as we'll see later, we get benefits for pest control by using organic fertilizers. For example, if there are more birds, then the birds might eat some of the insects, which cause huge problems in agriculture, and then you may get honeybees, and honeybees make honey. The honey can be sold, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. So a bit more on soil conservation. The science, as they acknowledge, is very complex, but effectively there is this virtuous circle you see at the bottom if you get it right. You have nutrient availability for crops, i.e. the better kind of microbiology you get in soil. Soil microbiology is incredibly complex, but if you look at books like The Secret Life of Trees and other books, there are a number of others, particularly around soil health, it's very clear that there's a lot that goes on with microbiology in soils that we don't know very much about. But if you look at how trees communicate, and yes, they do, with each other, they do that through soil microbiological organisms. And we're still finding out a lot about those, but they're incredibly important for spreading nutrients around under the ground in ways that we can't see. And of course, if we have cover crops and we have trees and agroforestry and we have better soils, we retain water. That helps root systems be developed, and that holds soil together as well. And then, of course, if there's a drought, it's often been found that farms farmed under regenerative practices have a much greater resilience to drought. And of course, with climate change, drought is becoming a bigger and bigger problem in farming around the world as weather becomes more volatile. So I won't read all of this out, as you'll be pleased to know, but this is the kind of things you see. And again, this isn't that different from a Nestle point of view from the hardcore approaches you might call those of the Regenerative Organic Certified. Effectively, it's about running an ecosystem-based approach to agriculture. And that's what this is all about in terms of a description. So let's move on from the world's largest food company to a company called Cotton Connect. Cotton Connect is a company that it's a social enterprise actually, which focuses on piloting regenerative agriculture and making cotton farmers more sustainable in places like India and Pakistan. And the reason they do this is because some of the big brands they work with want to buy sustainable cotton, and Cotton Connect helps farmers make cotton more sustainable. So they start with the sustainability program, which helps farmers reduce inputs and maximize outputs. And on top of that, they have placed a regenerative agriculture program, which encourages much more around agroforestry, soil health, and ecosystem development. So important to distinguish between sustainable in this case and regenerative. Sustainability is really about better farm management, reducing inputs and taking a modern approach to agriculture in many cases, whereas the regenerative bit on top is focusing on nature restoration and the benefits we get from that. So they're training farmers in how they do this. And of course, to go back to the earlier point, you could argue that some of this is not new. A lot of regenerative agricultural practices are simply what was done before World War II. Because before World War II, there weren't synthetic fertilizers and pesticides around in the same quantities. In fact, there were hardly any available at all. And so if you go back to the 30s, 20s, and prior to that, regenerative and organic agriculture was just simply how agriculture was done. Of course, back then there was a lot of disease, a lot of misunderstanding of science, and yield wasn't very good. So it's all very well to say, 100 years ago everything was better, but 100 years ago everybody was smaller, sicker, lived for a lot fewer years, and didn't have the same kind of nutrition we have today. So it's important not to overly romanticize agriculture from 80, 100 years ago. It was much harder then than it is today. Nevertheless, some of the old ways of doing things, such as have been just described, are now definitely part of regenerative approaches today. And we can see here, if you look at the quote from Hardeep Desai here, who I was with just a couple of weeks ago, chatting to him about all of this, they have very good early data from their regenerative agriculture approach with farmers. The full data won't be available till next year, but it looks very much like putting regenerative on top of sustainable. Cotton farming is helping both yields and the environment. And of course, if it helps yields, it helps farmers economically, which means they can live better lives. Children can go to school, nutrition is better, etc. So far from the Cotton Connect approach to regenerative, it looks like it's pretty successful. The question is, how do you get it to scale? Well, they're working with more than 3,000 farmers on this. 3,000 farmers is quite a lot. So it's going to be quite interesting to see how you take the 3,000, turn it into 30,000, 300,000, and then 3 million. And that's going to be difficult because in every country or every geography or every region, biodiversity, soil structure is different. So that's why it's a challenge to scale this, but we're only at the very beginning, and it has to be done piece by piece rather than simply saying everything's going to be this way. We've got to make sure that we adjust practices for the right geology and geography. You'll note here, there's a quote here from Arif Makdum talking about birds eating pests. That sounds perhaps all a bit small scale, but actually the bollworm is one of the biggest problems for the cotton crop. The bollworm likes to destroy cotton crops, and if birds eat the larvae of the bollworm, they can cause enormous gains for cotton production. So actually, if you have 3,000 farmers with greater bird life, they will have much less need for synthetic fertilizers or synthetic pesticides, rather, to kill the bollworm if they've got birds doing it. So this stuff is actually quite serious. When you put it across 3,000 farms, that makes quite a big impact in terms of reducing inputs. This is the Cotton Connect theory of change. Every social enterprise or NGO has to have a theory of change. It's effectively their philosophy for how they approach things. And you've seen this on earlier slides really, so I'm not going to go into big detail about it. But if you look into how environmentalism works, everybody has a theory of change, so it's important to know that they exist. And of course, if you are going to do this sort of thing, you need to do it in partnership with credible institutions. So the University of Cambridge and others are helping Cotton Connect understand how this works in terms of carbon footprint analysis. So what does it mean to do all this work? 3,000 farmers who've been through the sustainability code. Now in the regenerative code, how do we measure soil carbon? How do we know the climate impact? Well, in the case of Cotton Connect, they've been taking carbon soil samples to measure carbon from 1 in 10 farms. So from 3,000 farmers, that might end up being a couple of hundred or more soil samples. It depends how many farmers are on each farm, of course. But the idea is to measure soil carbon and to look at the greenhouse gas emissions benefits of regenerative alongside the yield benefits. And of course, you can see here at the bottom of the slide, the biodiversity benefits as well. So change of pace again, back to another large food company, this time General Mills. General Mills makes a lot of products you would see in US supermarkets and indeed supermarkets around the world. They have a very ambitious approach to regenerative, 1 million acres. And of course, an acre and a hectare, very different. Hectare is much bigger. I think there's 2-point-something acres in a hectare, I believe. So still 1 million acres, quite a lot. And they've got to do an awful lot of work with North American farmers to make that happen. And they're doing it in the ways you've seen before, really. Economic resiliency, soil health, water, biodiversity, cow and herd well-being for dairy operations. Just a reminder, why are they doing this? Well, if you look at the number there, an enormous amount of the greenhouse gas emissions that they're responsible for come from agriculture. So we need to reduce those emissions. That's why they're doing this. Those are the 6 core principles. And again, it's a slightly different approach, but there's a lot in common with the earlier descriptions of regen. Effectively, it's about smarter farming rather than just dumping chemicals all over fields. It's taking a much more nuanced approach. Question is, what are the measured outcomes? Well, so far, it's unclear, but they've only been doing this for a couple of years. So we're going to need more time to get the results. You've seen this before. I won't dwell on this one. And this is an example of the kind of pilot program that they do. So this is looking at North America, describing how they're actually helping farmers get here. And farmers are very keen to do this. I had a conversation with Cargill, the world's largest agricultural trader, last week. And the head of these things at Cargill was saying that they opened up a pilot project to farmers who supply Cargill, saying we will support you in your journey, a bit like is described on this slide. And they were completely oversubscribed very, very quickly. And so farmers are very keen to learn about all of this because, you know, if you're a farmer working the land, you'd like a nicer landscape than just a monoculture. Particularly as farmers are now aware increasingly of the climate change impacts of just having a monoculture approach to agriculture and land use. So biodiversity, how do you measure the impact of that? Well, I'm not going to read all this out to you. You can look at it in your own time, but this is the kind of ways we are starting, or large companies are starting to try and measure this as part of pilot projects. And an insects inventory is one way, looking at birds, plant diversity, etc. So you can take a science-based approach to this to measure outcomes. Similarly, with water management, those protocols are in development. Soil as well, there are ways that you can measure soil carbon sequestration. For example, going 1 meter deep and looking at how that changes or impacts on your greenhouse gas emission models. And of course, we've got to make sure the economics add up. So tracking economic data and all of the kind of inputs used. Again, this, a bit like Nestle's approach, General Mills is not saying that regenerative means organic. It is saying reduce pesticides and fungicides because they can't simply switch to organic. It would be economically devastating for their farmers. That's something that may happen over time, who knows? But of course, as we know, some organic practices have negative externalities, like tilling the soil. So you have to be quite careful about which of these approaches you choose. And the large companies are taking an approach that says reduce inputs, focus on ecosystems, measure, track, and let's see what happens. So, in conclusion, regenerative agriculture may be an old idea, but its implementation at scale is clearly very complex. You can't just take one approach in one place and put it in another. You have to look at everywhere in its local context and understand what the best approach is. You could argue that it's greenwash, but that depends on your point of view, and it depends on the example you're observing. So if regenerative is built on existing rigorous standards on sustainable agriculture, that doesn't mean it's going to be greenwash, because it can literally be the icing on the cake, which can be rather important. So you have to look at what regenerative agriculture approaches are built on to understand whether or not they are credible. And the key is really about both yield and climate resilience. So smallholders, by which I mean those who farm small farms, not small farmers physically, that one of the big benefits for them is income diversification. So, more animals, bees, other products, other crops that they can grow in a landscape. For example, that pea product I mentioned from Nestle, why can't you grow peas and sell them to Nestle to make milk from, alongside your main crop? So diversification is clearly important for smallholders. For larger farmers, it's harder to do that because you're dealing with much bigger fields. Nevertheless, there are possibilities there, as we're seeing with crop rotation. Complementary crops that can be rotated every 6 months could help with diversification, but often the business case is based around improving or focusing on not losing yield in the short term, and in the medium to longer term, climate resilience is highly important so that we can adapt as best we can to the volatility that is in the air at the moment due to ongoing climate change. So the results so far are very, very dependent on where, and also on human culture as well. How do you teach regenerative? There's an awful lot of farmers I've come across who do silly things, technically, scientifically speaking, because that's what their father did, or their mother did, or their grandfather or their grandmother did. There's quite a lot of grape growers, for example, in the south of France, who still use chemicals because that's what granddad did. But his father, granddad's father, wouldn't have had any chemicals. So culture is a funny thing. It has to be used appropriately, and sometimes there's a culture of doing things a certain way which only goes back a couple of generations. The early signs look pretty good in cotton. So yield is actually up in regenerative from the sustainability code farms that they're using, and that is preliminary data, but it certainly looks good at the moment. The larger companies, it's going to take more time. Nestle's 30 pilot farms, which we hope to be working with them on, that's going to take some years, and of course then you've got to work out how you scale it. So it's not going to be easy, but clearly it's the approach that large food companies, as well as small trendy regenerative organic certified companies, all want to take. They just have different definitions of what regenerative means. So is regenerative just another badge on food for you? You've all seen lots of eco labels everywhere in the world. Is regenerative just another one of those? Well, maybe, but indications are that consumers do respond quite well to it. It's a clearer term than sustainable, and in order for it to be credible, as I mentioned, it has to be built on the years of sustainability work. And if it ends up being the dominant approach to consumers, as long as that works, that's no bad thing. So just to finalise, a quote from Cotton Connect: in the last 10 years, our agronomic programs have boosted profits by 36%, yields by 11%, cut water use by 13%, and pesticide use by 26%. That's all significant cost savings and economic benefits for farmers. I anticipate the data we'll see from them next year will show also increased yields in cotton due to regenerative practices, which is great news. And if you want to do some further reading, have a look at these links, various insights here into how regenerative may lead, particularly in the third link here, to the ecosystem services market link. We may see that farmers actually start to get payments for doing this, for managing ecosystem services. The question is who's going to pay, and what's the mechanism for doing it, and what are the measurements, and so on, which is all very complex. But farmers may actually be able to get an additional benefit for this from carbon markets. And that is underway at the moment in terms of developing those mechanisms, but it's very, very complicated. If you're interested to know more about that, you can go to the Innovation Forum website, where we hosted a webinar about this recently in terms of what needs to be thought about to develop effective carbon markets for farmers to receive payments, because it is very complicated. But we are making progress in the journey towards sustainable agriculture. So that's it. I hope that was helpful and useful for you in some way, and I'm very happy now to take questions, but I will stop the recording for that.